This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. You can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. My name's Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. Now today's episode of Knowing Animals is part of our intermittent Protecting Animals series in which we talk to animal advocates about the work they do for animals. The episode is brought to you by AASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. AASA is one of the most significant scholarly organisations devoted to animal studies. If you're an academic, an artist, a student, an activist, or anyone else interested in animal studies, I encourage you to join today. Membership is very reasonably priced and comes with a range of benefits. The episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. This is a collection of books about animal studies. For authors, you should know that the series is currently accepting submissions. So if you're writing a book about animal studies, you should get in touch. And for readers, I let you know that the books are very fairly priced, and in fact, some of them are open access. So if you're looking for the next read, look no further. This week, I'm very pleased to introduce you to Erik Marcus. Erik is the man behind the website vegan.com, as well as the vegan.com Twitter feed and other social media presences. He's also the author of a number of popular books, including Meat Market, The Ultimate Vegan Guide, A Vegan History, Vegan, the New Ethics of Eating, and Self-Care for Activists. Today we're going to talk a bit about vegan.com, including one of the website's most visited pages, an essay called Why Go Vegan. Welcome to the podcast, Erik.
Hey Josh, I am just delighted to be here and thank you for the invitation.
Can you start by telling us what inspired you to get involved in animal activism?
Well, I grew up in the 1970s, and at that point, vegetarianism was as fringe a diet as you could ever imagine. And by the time I got into high school in the early 80s, I had very much a standard American diet, probably ate meat at least a couple times a day. And then immediately after high school, in my first year of college, this was still back in the days of VCRs, somebody in a neighboring dorm room was playing a video showing the inside of a slaughterhouse. And I was just appalled. And I could not believe what I was seeing. All of a sudden, the ramifications of my diet became clear in an instant. And I did not make any immediate changes in how I ate because honestly, the thought of going meat free just seemed impossible. I had no idea how to rejigger my diet accordingly. So it happened that a few months after that, there's a popular rock band called Boston. And when they came out with their third album, I bought it right when it came out. And the liner notes said that most of the people of the band were vegetarian. And if you wanted some information, well, write to this address, which was the Farm Animal Reform Movement. I reluctantly sent off to that address, and I was just envisioning moving towards a diet that was just incredibly plain and unsatisfying and boring and required all kinds of discipline to follow. Anyway, they sent me a few weeks later, they sent me back this little trifold thing, just giving some examples of vegetarian foods. And I just started to incorporate more vegetarian foods into my diet. It probably took me about 6 months to do the transition. You have to know that in 1986, vegetarians were incredibly rare, and it wasn't as if you had people you could turn to for help. There wasn't the internet, so you couldn't go online to get good information. So you pretty much had to. Everybody moving towards a vegetarian or vegan diet had to reinvent the wheel. They had to figure it out on their own, really. There were only a few vegetarian cookbooks at the time, and there frankly weren't even any vegan cookbooks back when I became vegan, apart from maybe some self-published Xerox jobs. And then a year or so after that, I started to discover that the milk and egg industries are every bit as cruel as the meat industry. And in fact, really the only difference between meat and milk and eggs is that meat comes from animals who have been killed, whereas milk and eggs come from animals who will be killed. And it's just guaranteed unless they die prematurely from injury or disease. By my junior year of college, when I was around 20, I started to get serious about getting the dairy products and eggs out of my diet. I actually have written a really lengthy guide to how to go vegan, which is on vegan.com. Just go to vegan.com/how. And I sort of give some pretty non-obvious pieces of advice about moving in a more rapidly towards a vegan diet, and how you can do that without any real sacrifice. Yeah, I did all this in the mid 80s, and it really predated vegetarian being a mainstream topic. I very much felt on the fringes, and veganism back then was essentially unheard of. People couldn't even pronounce the word, much less know what it meant.
So, how did vegan.com come about?
As the 90s progressed, it became increasingly evident to me that I needed to spend a big portion of my life doing things that would protect farmed animals. It just, as it became clear to me that we were looking at in the United States, 5, 6, 7 billion animals being slaughtered every year, and very few people working on that issue, I knew that I had to devote a chunk of my life to it. I guess the thing that attracted me to this was, especially in the early and mid '90s, a lot of the vegan advocacy material just was not as accurate as it needed to be. And I think integrity is really important and credibility is really important. And so by around 1996, 1997, I realized I could piss and moan about how inadequate the movement's literature was, or I could do something about it. And, I have a background in writing and had been supporting myself as a technical writer. And I think I have pretty good research and critical thinking skills. So around 1996, 97, I moved to Ithaca, New York, where Cornell University is, so that I could access their veterinary and agriculture libraries and really start digging into the primary source material related to animals and environmental issues. And this in turn would enable me to write a heavily researched book on the topic. And that book came out in 97, or I guess 1998. It was called Vegan, The New Ethics of Eating. It was my first book, and still to this day, my most successful book. It kind of came out at the right time. We made the decision to title the book in great big letters, Vegan, The New Ethics of Eating. At the time, nobody knew what vegan meant, much less how to pronounce it. And so I think it was a pretty brave decision to choose that weird word for the name of my first book. But my reasoning was that, hey, even if people don't read the book, they're likely to see this word for the first time, and that will help to mainstream the entire concept. And I think it played a part. If you've never written a book before, you may not know that it usually takes over a year from the time the book is finished until the time it shows up on bookstore shelves. So I had some time on my hands, and as a new writer, an unpublished writer, I had to think about, okay, well, how am I going to keep this book from flopping? This was just when the internet was starting to go mainstream. So I decided, okay, well, I'm going to build a website to promote the book. Unfortunately, the domain name in 97, vegan.com, that was the obvious domain name for this book, but that was already taken. But the person who owned it didn't really buy it to publish a website. He bought it just to have a constant email address, because in the early days of the web, the internet companies were always going out of business and you were losing your email. He had this domain name. He knew that as the web was getting bigger, that this was potentially a valuable domain name, but he wasn't some scumbag domain squatter looking to capitalize on things. He wanted to make sure that the domain would be put to good use. So I reached out to him and he asked me to send him a copy of my manuscript. And he was sufficiently impressed that he sold me the website for a nominal sum. And of course, over the last several decades, vegan.com has certainly had a much, much greater impact on the vegan world than all of my books put together. So even though I initially got vegan.com to promote my first book, it wasn't too long before it started taking the bulk of my energies. And now the website is very much what I strive to do with vegan.com is offer definitive content on every topic of importance in the vegan world, whether it's Indian food or nutrition or how to go vegan or the ethics of using wool. I mean, if it touches on veganism, I try to write the definitive piece and take it real seriously and try to give you something that's well written and really answers all your questions. I've written virtually everything on the site except for a few articles that I don't consider myself an expert on. Most notably, our nutrition article was written by who I think is the top person in vegan nutrition, Ginny Messina, who's on Twitter at the Vegan RD. But by and large, I've written 99% of the content on vegan.com, and it's taken years of my life. It's turned into kind of my magnum opus, the most important thing I've done for animals and with my life. And I like where it is. I like where the site is now, and it's a popular website. And every day, a couple thousand people are turning to it for advice on every topic related to veganism. So that makes me feel pretty good.
So, who's the target audience of vegan.com? Is it current vegans or prospective vegans?
Well, it's anyone who wants to know anything about veganism, whether you're a level 5 30-year vegan or whether you just want to start adding some veggie burgers to your diet and have no interest in veganism at all. I mean, whatever, if you are interested in some facet of being vegan or just eating more vegan foods, I think that, well, I aspire to offer definitive coverage on food, on health, and of course on animals. And this kind of leads to what I regard to as the most important article on vegan.com, which is my Why Go Vegan article. It's a little under 10,000 words. You could read it in an hour. And what I've done with this piece is I've already written 3 books that deal with the topic of why to go vegan. And having written 3 books on the topic, I don't think that a book is the ideal format. I think what you really want is something you can read in a long sitting. I think that's sufficient to get you adequately immersed in the topic, but you shouldn't have to read 300 pages to make up your mind about whether a vegan diet is for you. What I try to do with this piece is take the expertise I acquired from writing actual books on the topic and distill all the key details down into something you can read in just one sitting.
So, what are the top reasons that you're addressing here? You're covering lots of bases.
Yeah. Well, obviously the most important one to me and also the hardest one to write about is animal issues and animal exploitation. And I take up the essay introduces topics like animal welfare and animal rights, and it addresses factory farming, and it addresses free range and higher welfare farming and the problems that even the best forms of animal agribusiness cannot solve because kind of what's baked into the system. So it looks at things in a comprehensive way. And, the real difficulty in writing about animal use and abuse is that it's just such a distressing topic. And so, on the one hand, you need to cover it with some thoroughness, but you also need to do it with a deft touch so it doesn't frighten people away and make them stop reading. So it's really as somebody who's spent my entire adult life writing nearly every day, I have to say that the topic of farm animals is really the trickiest thing you could possibly write about, because you're always walking the line between being careful and accurate and detailed and nuanced, but also you can't cross the line to just turning it into a full-on horror show, because people will simply stop reading. And the essay, of course, also gets into health and environmental issues. And as you might know, I do reject many commonly advanced vegan arguments. I think vegans often push or even usually push the health argument further than it can really go. I think you can absolutely eat a super healthy vegan diet and live to an old age, but it's not as cut and dried. It's not. I would never say that, like, oh, the only healthy diet is a vegan diet, or that a vegan diet will guarantee you live to a ripe old age. Unfortunately, I think at the age we're at, we probably I certainly have lost friends to cancer and to heart disease who've been longtime vegans. I'm under no illusions about what the diet can and can't protect you from. Similarly, vegans sometimes make environmental arguments that are kind of on the flaky side, most notably in regard to water use. I looked at that very carefully in writing my second book, Meat Market Animals, Ethics, and Money. I have no doubt that certain forms of meat production use more water than is required for an equal amount of calories from vegan foods, but the exact amount of water is like this is such a knotty, tricky, difficult topic, and it's really impossible to come up with a very specific, accurate figure. And again, this just gets back to credibility. I do not want to ever trick somebody into going vegan by playing fast and loose with what's true. I really think that you can operate as an effective vegan advocate from a point of very high integrity. And I just think that that's the way to go. If I don't think there's any need to fudge the facts, like the case for being vegan, as my Why Go Vegan piece indicates, is really so incredibly strong. We have so many slam dunk arguments that are really irrefutable that it just drives me nuts to hear people select arguments that are easily debunked.
One of the ideas that you mention a few times in the essay that I've not really heard before, or not heard in quite this way, is that it's actually easier to be vegan than it is to be an ethical omnivore. So could you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, in fact, the word I want to use in here, and that I used in my essay, is lazy. Laziness can be a virtue. I mean, I'd rather not spend time doing difficult things if there's no need. And to me, it's like, there is just so much incentive for animal agribusiness and meat, milk, egg producers to either exaggerate the welfare they keep the animals under, or to just lie outright. I mean, they're under tremendous incentive to just paint a very happy picture about how their animals are raised. And you often hear from the conscientious omnivore crowd how good it is to shake your rancher's hand and know who you're buying meat from. And that's true only to the point that you can trust these people. And I'm not saying they're all untrustworthy, but I am saying that shaking your rancher's hand is not enough. If you really want to know where your meat comes from, you got to pay that farm a visit. And and preferably pay that farm multiple visits, so it's not some Potemkin village that they're selling you on, that you're just seeing on that Saturday where they clean everything up. And what does that mean? That means that you're going to have to take one of your precious Saturday mornings and drive out of town and spend a few hours checking up on the welfare of where you're sourcing your meat, milk, or eggs. man, I would rather do almost anything but that. And so I really like the fact that a vegan diet gets me off the hook for doing those things, and I could, play video games, or relax around the house, or read a book, or do 100 other things I prefer to do, rather than drive out and babysit some farmer and make sure he or she is doing right by their animals. I mean, that's not how I want to spend my time.
Now, as you know, Knowing Animals usually focuses on interviewing academics about their academic research, and you've already talked about the importance of reading the primary sources and getting to grips with what's really going on. So let me ask you, with your activist hat on, what kinds of scholarly research do you draw upon for vegan.com? Is it just the kind of nutrition work and the agriculture work, or is it also arts and social sciences work? And what kinds of scholarly research would you like to see more of?
Wow, that's, to be frank, that's not a question I've given a lot of thought to. And it's not because I haven't read a significant amount of academic coverage of these topics. I will say that I can think of a few different books written on slaughterhouse and meat issues written by sociologists, for example. And it's kind of heartbreaking to me to read this stuff, because a lot of the time they're introducing some very important topics and covering them beautifully, but the writing is often so academic that there's just no way the general public would ever get through a book of that kind. I think that, to whatever extent an academic can tailor their language so that it's accessible to the mainstream, I'd like to see more of that. I'd like to see more accessible literature coming from people who've actually carefully studied this topic. And hand in glove with that is I'm really sick of seeing $80 140-page books that are really only going to sell to university libraries. These books will only sell 1,200 copies, and they're not going to be owned by any individual. I mean, I have a lot of trouble with sort of the academic publishing market and how it causes the books to be in limited distribution and incredibly overpriced, to the point that an activist could never afford to add them to their library.
Absolutely. And I think what's really nice is that a lot of academics are going to agree with you on this. And this is something we talk about again and again here on Knowing Animals. A lot of academics are very keen to speak to this broader audience, whether that's the activist audience, whether that's the general public, whether that's a policymaker audience, whether that's farmers and other people who work directly with animals. But there are certain incentive structures that make that quite difficult, such as current norms in academic publishing. And academic publishing has its place, but you're quite right that academic publishing is often not well placed to have this communication outside of academia. And I think that is a problem. And that is a problem that we in the animal studies community acknowledge. And I too would be excited to see further developments in that area. And I should say, of course, that recording this podcast is part of that hope. It's part of trying to make academic research a little bit more accessible to a broader audience, whether that's because the podcast is free, or whether that's because this is a chance for people to put their quite technical research into more accessible language.
Oh, absolutely. I was delighted to discover your podcast precisely because it frankly forces people who largely lack practice and capacity to write in plain speaking, everyday terms to actually have the sort of conversation you'd have over a couple of beers and be a little more informal. When I was writing my first book, Vegan, the New Ethics of Eating, it just so happened I went to some library book sale and I encountered a book by a guy named Rudolf Fleisch. And you might know that term because it's one of the key tools to score the ease of the readability of your writing was developed by Fleisch. He's written a few very simple books that talk about speaking in and writing in very plain, easy terms, shortening your sentences and speaking in the active voice rather than the passive, and not needlessly cluttering your sentences with $10 words, 10-pound words, unless there's a compelling need. I guess a 10-pound word really isn't worth as much as it used to be. But anyway, so I would really urge anyone in your community, in the academic animal protection community, who really wants to learn how to pitch their work to the broader public, to go back and read some Rudolf Fleisch. And there's another really good book that probably the top bestseller for the past 30 years on nonfiction. It's called On Writing Well by William Zinsser. And man, that is a book that academics in the humanities and sociology and so forth, a lot of them, most of them, I think would really, really benefit by reading some Zinsser and some Fleisch.
Now, Erik, we ask everybody who comes on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I don't know, but I'll do my best.
And a reminder to listeners that these are the Protecting Animals 5 quick questions, so they are a little different to usual. So can you recall when you first started to think that there's something wrong or problematic about the human-non-human animal relationship?
Oh yeah. I mean, it's what I told you earlier. I walked into a room and saw video footage of animals getting their throats cut. If that's not non-consensual and horrifically violent, I don't know what is. I mean, I just couldn't imagine anything more disturbing to watch. And to this day, I've watched hours and hours of factory farming and slaughterhouse footage, much to my detriment, and it never gets any easier. And it just is a clear indication of how screwed up the human relationship to animals remains.
Can you recall the first thing you did to try and bring about change for animals?
Yeah. I mean, I think for most of us, what we do is an outgrowth of whatever technology exists at the time. And I was a Macintosh enthusiast in the early 90s, and there used to be something called HyperCard that enabled just everyday people to create their own simple computer programs. So I spent a chunk of a summer creating this big HyperCard stack that covered all the vegan topics I could think of. In some ways, and since HyperCard was one of the first hypertext products, it predated the web by 7 or 8 years, at least 5 years. So I was doing hypertext before the web. And I like to think that maybe that gave me a head start when it came to actually coding vegan.com and thinking about what a website covering vegan issues ought to be. So anyway, this HyperCard stack was called VeggieCard, and it was pretty widely distributed. And it was a cool first thing to do when I was in my early 20s. It made a difference. I don't know how much of a difference, but it was a cool thing to work on.
If you had to name one animal advocate who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Oh, it was Henry Spear all the way. I was lucky enough to, I went to Columbia for graduate school, and he was living in New York City in Manhattan, so maybe 30, 40 blocks from Columbia. So I got to meet up with him a bunch of times, and he really went out of his way to mentor me and to support my work. And I did some research from him early on. And I would really urge anybody who's never heard of Henry Spear to read the Peter Singer book. Peter Singer wrote a wonderful biography of him called Ethics into Action. It's just a marvelous book that shows the massive impact that one person can have. And I think it was Henry Spear that led me to come up with kind of my animal millionaires concept, that just like if you really, really want to apply yourself, you could probably make $1 million in your lifetime. If you really, really want to apply yourself and think big, you could save 1 million animals in your lifetime. And I decided that in my 20s, that I was going to do everything I could to become an animal millionaire and to think in big enough terms. And Henry Spear really opened the door to me in terms of seeing that was not that was not unachievable if I applied myself.
What do you think is the most important thing that animal advocates can do for animals?
One of the big thing, well, two things. Number one, inform yourself. Do not just be vegan. Be like, put yourself at the top 1% in terms of being well informed. Know the topic backwards and forwards so that when any question comes up, you can really answer back in a way that is authoritative and persuasive. That's the first thing. And the second thing that can really make a difference is to work in your own community. Wherever you live, find a way to support your local vegan restaurants, to either participate in your local meetup or start one. Build local community. I mean, one of my, even though I publish vegan.com, that ought to keep me busy enough. One of my hobbies is to just write Google Maps reviews for vegan restaurants. And I've written dozens and dozens and dozens of Google Maps reviews for vegan restaurants. Why? Because I know it really helps them. I mean, these people work so hard, and it's a real privilege to be able to shine the spotlight a little more on their business and so forth. Sometimes I go to these restaurants the day after I've reviewed them, and they notice me when I come in, and they're like just so effusive with thanking me. I mean, virtually every vegan restaurant owner checks Google Maps and Happy Cow every day to see if somebody has written about them. I mean, we all want feedback for what we do, but this is the kind of feedback that not only gives them the recognition they deserve, it can actually turn things around and make the difference between perishing and thriving as a business.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I would like to see the word ahimsa in greater use. You can go to vegan.com/ahimsa to get into that topic. It has to do with active nonviolence, not simply not harming, but actually preventing harm from happening. And it's a concept that very few vegans know about, but I think if more vegans knew about ahimsa, they'd be able to frame things in a way that moves the human animal dynamic in the sort of direction that we both want to see.
What are you working on next?
One of my core values is to do things anonymously as much as possible. So, I mean, vegan.com can't be helped. I have to take credit for the site because otherwise nobody would invite me on their podcasts. And it's just something I'm stuck with. But I do a lot of things. I do a double-digit percentage of my work on issues related to civil liberties, animal protection, Bitcoin, Austrian economics, privacy. These things are like really important to me, but if I took credit for them, it would increase my risk profile. It would make it harder for me to cross borders, and I like to travel. I'm continually working in those realms, often anonymously, so I can't really tell you about what I'm doing there.
How can people find out more about your work?
I have a simple one-page site, Erik Marcus, ErikMarcus.com. I mean, most of my work is on vegan.com. If you go there, you've got enough to keep you busy for several weeks. Hopefully I'll do more podcasts like this because I feel like the site is now more or less built out, and I should be going out of my way to have more conversations with people like you operating in different niches within veganism.
Well, thanks so much, Erik, for joining us for this podcast.
Josh, it's been a real delight, and I'm just grateful that you invited relatively non-academic person onto your show to talk about some of these issues, and I'm grateful for the opportunity.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars and activists about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. You can follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn or on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. Please do tell others about the podcast, spread the word, and as you've just heard, review the podcast. Reviews make it easier for others to find us. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.